right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ed Steinfeld. I'm the director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. I'm so happy to see you all tonight, and I'm really thrilled to welcome both Jeffrey Goldberg and George Packer. We are really fortunate to have two of the, in my view, the world's foremost experts who just write and argue so insightfully about U.S. foreign policy and global affairs. But to have them both here in conversation is, to me, it's a great personal privilege, but it's a privilege for the entire audience. I'm going to do some very brief introductions, and then we're going to turn to the conversation between Jeffrey and George, and they'll talk for about 45 minutes or so, and then they're going to open it up. There are two mics here, so, as we start getting toward the end of their conversation, I'm going to ask those of you, I hope everybody's going to have questions, to line up behind the mics, and we'll just expand the conversation out to everybody. But let me just briefly introduce our two guests. George Packer has been a staff writer at The Atlantic since 2018, and he had previously spent 15 years as a staff writer at The New Yorker. He's the author of multiple books on U.S. foreign policy, including The Assassin's Gate, America in Iraq, The Unwinding, an inner history of the New America, which is really about American contemporary affairs, a series of biographical sketches that's just phenomenal. And of course, the 2019 book, Our Man, Richard Holbrooke and the End of the American Century. Again, a book that I started reading and couldn't put down. Extraordinary book. That book, at least in my view, uses biography and a biographical account of a particular U.S. diplomat, Richard Holbrooke, also, of course, a Brown graduate, but it uses biography to tell the story of not just one individual, but also really the story about the motivations and impulses and ambitions that have shaped U.S. foreign policy late in the Cold War, but especially in the post-Cold War world. Jeffrey Goldberg is editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, a position he's held since 2016. Prior to assuming the editor-in-chief role, Jeffrey served as a staff writer and journalist and leading foreign affairs commentator in publications ranging from The Atlantic, of course, to The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The Forward, The Jerusalem Post, and The Washington Post. Jeff's the author of the 2006 book, Prisoners, a Muslim and a Jew Across the Middle East Divide, which again is an extraordinary book. I highly recommend it. It's an account of Jeff's experience as a military policeman, as a soldier serving in an Israeli army prison, and the story of his engagement with and befriending of a particular individual, Rafiq. But again, the story of people in the Middle East, again, a book I couldn't put down. I also want to call attention to one other piece that Jeffrey wrote, this one in 2016. It was the Atlantic cover story, The Obama Doctrine. And in ways that I think are similar to George's book, Our Man, The Obama Doctrine did such an incredible job of really defining and explaining American strategy, maybe explaining it better than those who were officially trying to explain it. But it really provided insight and educated me about how U.S. foreign policy is formulated, what the underlying logic is, and again, in a way that I found much clearer than the policymakers themselves were articulating. So with that, let me turn the conversation over to you both, and again, please join me in welcoming and thanking our guests.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and thank you all for coming. It's too cold for me, but apparently hardy New Englanders can handle this. Thank you for the warm introduction. Thank you to Watson and to Brown. I have a lot of affection for Brown. I have a lot of family connections to Brown, and I have to thank Brown for something important in my life. A long time ago, the Brown Admissions Committee decided that I should go to Penn. And I want to thank them for that. And of course, the impetus for this conversation is the fact that Richard Holbrooke is a graduate of Brown University. That's when we started talking about coming up here and doing something. And George actually in this book doesn't write that much about the Brown years, although he was the editor of the BDH and did some various other interesting things here. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about Holbrooke directly and maybe some context about the Brown years. And talk a little bit more broadly about the theme of the book, and the book is a lot larger than just the very large life of Richard Holbrooke, as those of you who've read it know. It really, his life tracks the ups and downs of American foreign policy and America's role in the world. And then as a bonus, I'll ask him about impeachment, get his up-to-date views, sort of MSNBC style, just for 2 minutes, because we both can't stand that stuff. By the way, for some reason...
You're a lot better at it than I am, Jeff.
That was a true insult. For whatever reason, I guess we both respect Brown, but we both decided to dress as lawyers tonight. It's really interesting. And then we can just sort of jump into... the subject, the overwhelming subject, and of course, impeachment is a weird. The subject of the impeachment hearings is a weird manifestation of a foreign policy gone awry, and we can talk in the context of Bush, Obama, and now Trump. What presidential policy making means, and where is America in the world, and are we in decline, and we can run through the whole thing, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions. So I'll start by just noting, and I hope that those of you who haven't read this book read this book. It's one of the most remarkable biographies I've ever read. If you can believe it, it's a 600-page biography of an American diplomat who didn't even reach the highest heights that you can't put down. I mean, it's written in a kind of magnetic and propulsive style, and George finds the deepest meaning in his life, and it's really just a wonderful book. And I was, of course, as George and I have been friends for a long time since my New Yorker days. He's a recent refugee from the New Yorker. And I say that not as an insult at all to the New Yorker. We love the New Yorker.
But there was a terrible civil war.
There was a terrible civil war. And then when Trump abandoned the Kurds, and the Kurds of the New Yorker, it became even worse.
There was only one magazine that would let me in, and it was The Atlantic. Thank you.
We've been friends for a long time, and we've watched the waxing and waning of American influence in the world together for quite a while. So there's a lot to cover. But let's just start with two questions. Complicated question that maybe just take a minute on if you can is why you chose to write about Richard Holbrooke. And the second question is, in that context, tell us a little bit about what he was like at Brown, how Brown might have shaped what he was interested in doing in the world, and there's a couple of interesting stories about that.
You know, I did not choose this book. It chose me, which is a strange way to get into a book, because usually, for me at least, a book kind of gestates in you for a long time, and you become obsessed with a subject that you finally just have to to get out of your system by writing about it. Whereas this was different. He died very abruptly, literally in the Secretary of State's office. At least that was when the health event that caused his death happened, with Hillary Clinton looking at him and saying, "My God, Richard, what's happening to you?" And the drama of that moment was so much of a piece with every moment of his life, which was dramatic often in itself, in which he had a capacity to dramatize even beyond its own merits. And he kind of dramatized his death in a really successful way by having it happen in the office that he had always wanted to occupy and never quite reached, except as Hillary Clinton's trusted advisor. A few weeks later, a couple of his friends asked me if I would want to write a book about him. And I think they came to me because I had profiled him in the New Yorker. Not a piece I like to linger on. I think I didn't quite understand basically just how bad things were between Holbrooke and President Obama, between Holbrooke and President Karzai in Afghanistan, really between Holbrooke and almost everyone. So it lacked the inside view that I really needed to understand what he was doing at the end of his life. But after his death, his friends said he would be a great subject. And I kind of thought of it already. This man, being in his presence was mesmerizing. It was enraging. He found ways to seduce you, to fascinate you, to flatter you, to one-up you, and to humiliate you, sometimes within about 10 seconds. So he was always in motion. And while he was alive, you just had to keep watching him, even if you didn't like everything you were seeing. And so he did occur to me as a subject for a book. But it was when I spoke to his widow, Kati Martin, literally a month after he died, and said, would you let me have his papers with no strings attached? And she agreed. That I kind of got myself into it. And I still didn't know why I was doing it, just that the papers were there. They were in these big black filing cabinets in his office in Lower Manhattan. And someone else was going to get them if I didn't. I had no idea what was in them. Neither did his widow. An Israeli moving company brought them across the Brooklyn Bridge to my little home office in Brooklyn, and there they sat for 7 years. I couldn't even open my door all the way because Holbrooke was looming so massively against my bookshelves and next to the door. And in those papers were letters, were diaries, recorded diaries, scraps of notes to himself on hotel stationaries, sporadic, not systematic, but every time he sat down to write something, including here at Brown, he wrote really well and in a way that 40, 50, 60 years later, you still wanted to read it. It had a kind of permanent intelligence and insight, and also just a literary quality that's very rare, I find, among everyone, including diplomats and government officials. Very rare among government officials. So reading those papers made me realize I had done the right thing in signing up for this project. Writing the book was another matter, because by the time I began to write, his reputation was already fading out. It's unbelievable how ruthless history is to people who, while they're alive, seem like to dominate every conversation. Within a couple of years, they're mostly forgotten because we move on. The present consumes us, especially right now. So I had to figure out a way to make Holbrooke come alive and be an urgent and pleasurable subject for readers who may not have even heard of him. And that was the writing of the book. So let's go to Brown. So he grew up in New York, in the city, in Scarsdale. His father died when he was young, which is a key event in his life. His parents were both Jewish refugees from the Nazis and the communists. And so he had that post-war son of refugees consciousness, but he actively suppressed any Jewish identity that he might have been able to claim. He did not want to be Jewish, or felt no attachment to that. He came to Brown in 1959, and within a couple of years was the editor of the Brown Daily Herald. And there was an incident that says a lot about him. So in '61, a young student, a woman, Catherine Pierce, wrote an essay in the BDH about Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, which was beginning to make itself felt in the consciousness of Americans. And she was critical of it. And Malcolm X contacted the Brown Daily Herald and said, I want to come and speak on campus and give our view and tell our side of the story. And Holbrooke loved this idea, and he actually enlisted an official from the local NAACP to debate Malcolm X. Brown was uneasy about this. They were concerned that Malcolm X traveled with security, the fruit of Islam. Could there be violence? Would Malcolm X provoke violence? Everyone was very nervous. And Holbrooke said, if you ban this talk, which was going to happen, I'm going to take the Brown Daily Herald off campus and sever its ties to the university forever, or as long as I'm in charge. Brown yielded. The NAACP guy dropped out, so it was just Malcolm X. And he gave a fiery speech, and afterwards sat around with students for hours in some student lounge and answered questions. And it was kind of an incredible night in the history of Brown. And it was because Richard Holbrooke had a journalistic instinct for a good story and a kind of fearlessness and a desire to stir things up, which remained with him for his entire career and made him very unusual among diplomats and among government officials.
He always was looking for the main thing. He wanted to be at the hot center of whatever it was that was going on. So, in other words, if he can create tumult at Brown, he would create tumult at Brown. He would create
Absolutely.
tumult wherever he
went, which when we get to the end of this brief story, you'll understand why Barack Obama didn't care for him.
Right.
Remember, no drama, Obama.
Right. So the book follows. I mean, it's not as neat as I'm describing it. No, nothing is. But you could trace Holbrooke's professional life across three conflicts that track interestingly about America's role in the world: Vietnam, and then Bosnia, and then Afghanistan. Talk about, as briefly as possible. Obviously, it's a 600-page book.
I think I'm just going to read.
You can just read the whole book.
Yeah.
It's fine. Nobody's
You
anything
guys
to do.
have the evening, right?
But to talk about where America was in Vietnam, and then there is this kind of peak in a way at Bosnia. If you're talking about the humanitarian interventionist impulse that he embodied, Bosnia is a high point. And then there's Afghanistan, which is just, it's not necessarily as clear-cut as Vietnam was by the end. It's just muddy and confusing and unpleasant and never-ending. And, well, you define it.
Yeah. I'd say Afghanistan looks more and more like Vietnam as the years go by. But so in '63, Holbrooke did not get a job at the New York Times, which he wanted, and decided, if I can't start at the Times, I'm not going to be a journalist.
He should have gone to Penn, because you get,
I mean, I was thinking when you lamented, so he was rejected by the Times and therefore became one of the most famous American diplomats of the day. He instead took the Foreign Service exam. Foreign Service wanted him. It was the Kennedy era. Kennedy had told a whole generation of young people to serve their country. Holbrooke responded to that. He was also best friends with the son of Dean Rusk, who was Secretary of State under Kennedy. And that was his entry, his point of imagining himself as a diplomat, as Secretary of State, actually. His first job was in Vietnam, and he wouldn't have had it any other way, because you're right, Jeff, he wanted to be in the middle of the action, and Vietnam was the only war on offer at the time, and he wanted to see a war. That was what he wrote in these voluminous letters to his fiancée, later his first wife, Liddy Holbrooke, who was back here at Brown. Pembroke College, was that where they had women back then? I guess, yes. They had the women at Pembroke, yeah. Although Holbrooke, I have to say, he was a horrible sexist in many ways, but he did make a point of hiring women for the paper, which was unusual at the time, so we have to give him that. He wrote all these letters back to Brown, to his fiancée, about his time in Vietnam, and what was clear was he was having a great time. He was in the Foreign Service, but he was not at the embassy. He would have been he would have been caged as a desk officer at the embassy. Instead, he was an aid worker in the Mekong Delta, which is where the war was at its most intense in 1963, and immediately being unusually perceptive and self-honest, he saw two things. One, we were losing because we were using firepower as if this was a conventional war with the South Vietnamese army, and killing a lot of civilians and turning their survivors into the enemy. And two, we were lying to ourselves. We were sending reports from the field to Saigon and on to Washington to President Kennedy's desk that claimed things were going better than they were. Now we know all this. These are cliches of Vietnam. Too much firepower, war of attrition, lies, the Pentagon Papers, et cetera. But in '63, to be a 22-year-old at his first post and to see this and actually to kind of take it in and act on it was pretty extraordinary. He did not turn against the war. You don't do that when you're in the middle of a war and trying to make it a success for your own country. He believed we were the good guys. He didn't see us yet as the heavies in Vietnam, as he later did. We were the good guys. We were protecting the South Vietnamese from communist aggression. He actually compared it to the civil rights marchers in Birmingham, Alabama. It was freedom in Vietnam, freedom in Alabama. That was kind of the mindset of a liberal internationalist circa 1963. Within a few years, he had come to the view that we should never have gotten into this war. We didn't know what we were doing, and we had to negotiate our way out. But those years were the key to the rest of his career and formed him.
But he didn't abandon the liberal interventionist impulse. And he, obviously in Bosnia, one of the keys to his success is that he was willing to marry diplomacy to force or argue for force as a concentrating, as a concentrator for the parties. Talk about his belief in American indispensability, even in the shadow of Vietnam.
I think, unlike a lot of young diplomats of his generation, Vietnam did not fundamentally change him. For most of them, it either turned them into hawks who thought we fought with one arm tied behind our back, and if only Congress, the press, the public, Lyndon Johnson had let us fight, we could have won. That was the whole generation of neoconservatives came out of that view. The other view was the dovish one, which was we should never get into this again, this kind of situation again. We can be just as much a force for ill as for good. We should be a much more modest power and see that other countries have interests that may conflict with ours, but that we should not be involved. We don't have a responsibility or the ability to solve other people's problems. Holbrooke was totally a creature of the post-war generation who created NATO, the UN, the IMF, and the doctrine of containment. All the sort of the heroes of American diplomacy who shaped the liberal order coming out of World War II. He, in his DNA, he believed that there was no alternative to American leadership, that without it, we would have Nazi rule in Europe, or we would have Soviet domination of Europe, or we would have another genocide, or we would have civil wars, atrocities, et cetera. So it was hardly even a question for him. It was just what he fundamentally grew up believing, that we were indispensable, that if we didn't lead, no one would, and problems that seemed far away at first would eventually become our problems, and that we should get involved early, not necessarily with military force, but that we had a responsibility to use all the tools of our power to try to prevent those far-off problems from becoming giant problems. And that was sort of his worldview, and it came to a head with Bosnia.
Bosnia, the high point of his diplomatic career. Just do 1 minute on that, and then take us to his last great attempt to be the indispensable American and bring peace to a warring part of the world, Afghanistan.
Right, because he also saw himself as indispensable. You're right. We needed to lead, and he needed to lead us leading. So that was his ego, and in the book there's a great deal about his faults, and they were many. His ego was in uneasy tension and balance, and sometimes out of balance, with more of an idealistic side of him. After the Cold War ended, Holbrooke sort of saw the potential for America to come into its own. In other words, the Cold War kept in check, because the world was divided into two camps, this idea that democracy and human rights and American values could spread everywhere. at the end of the Cold War, there was this, it's hard to remember now, there was an incredible, almost utopianism that this was not just possible, but inevitable, because every other system had failed. And the only one...
Well, there's nothing like winning to suggest that you can win.
Vietnam,
and the Soviets
yes,
collapsed,
yeah.
and this was the system that was left.
Vietnam, for a lot of Americans, turned out not to be sort of the taste of sin that should have told us that we were mortal, but instead sort of a false dusk. And it was the end of the Cold War that brought us to the zenith of our power. In Vietnam, for many, no longer was applicable. It was a kind of accident of our history, but we were used to winning. Other than Vietnam, we were used to winning. The Cold War gave us this sense of almost omnipotence, which took different forms. But for Holbrooke, it meant when a really ugly war broke out in the middle of Europe as Yugoslavia fell apart, and the European allies, France and Britain, were manifestly unable to stop it. And people were being herded into concentration camps, and in some cases slaughtered in mass graves, which Europe had not seen since the 40s. For Holbrooke, this was both a strategic and a moral imperative. We had to be involved. Bill Clinton did not see it that way. Holbrooke was his Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and was, with Madeleine Albright and one or two others, the voice of intervention that Clinton did not really want to hear until finally in '95, the massacre at Srebrenica, where 7,000 Muslim men and boys were slaughtered by Serb militias, and the regular Serb army, Bosnian Serb army. And Holbrooke's best friend turned enemy, Anthony Lake, who was Clinton's national security advisor, came up with a strategy for how we could intervene to try to end the war. And in this total irony of history, Holbrooke became the guy who carried out his friend-turned-enemy Lake's plan and negotiated the end of that war at Dayton, a very flawed peace, but peace that was desperately needed. And it was his triumphant, his greatest moment.
And it's something that reified the idea that when you want something to get done, you've got to get America to do it, right?
Yeah, I mean, European diplomats had been saying things like, this is the hour of Europe, not America. This is our turn. We don't need you. And it turned out that Europe was divided. There was no Europe, as Henry Kissinger famously asked, what is Europe's phone number? And were weak and even kind of enabling of the slaughter, because they had peacekeepers in Bosnia whose presence became an excuse not to use air power against the aggressors, the Serbs, and instead to let the Serbs chip away and gradually wear down their enemies by killing enough of them, while British and French and Dutch peacekeepers stood by and basically did nothing, and sometimes even got themselves taken hostage.
So come to the near present, Afghanistan, and then let's come right into the Trump era. The Holbrooke magic that worked in Bosnia did not work in Afghanistan. Why?
Yeah, this is sort of where the tale turns, I think, kind of tragic. So he was out of government during the Bush years. He was always in government under Democrats and on Wall Street under Republicans. He was not a good banker, but he wanted money and made a lot and spent a lot and had at one point like 9 houses and was kind of he became part of what I see as a sort of legal corruption that implicated the political class in Washington. In some ways, in the worst light, you could say that people like Holbrooke sent other people's sons and daughters to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan while they got rich. And that's sort of the least charitable view of what the elite political class in Washington was like in those years after 9/11. And Holbrooke even went to Ukraine in 2004 as the guest of an oligarch named Viktor Pinchuk, and gave a speech for $100,000. So it sounds a little bit weirdly familiar. So he was not steeped in corruption by any means, but he, I would say, is the kind of figure who's partly responsible for the fact that Americans no longer trust our leaders to use our blood and treasure wisely. And I would say in that sense, maybe a little bit of an enabler of what of the Trump era. So his last round in government was as Barack Obama's special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. He would never have gotten that job if it hadn't been for Hillary Clinton, who was his friend and his patron and who really cared for him and needed his advice and whom he really cared for. They had a real friendship. Obama didn't care for Holbrooke. In fact, was so, I would even go so far as to say, repulsed by him, annoyed by his lecturing, his bluster, his self-drama, his flattery, everything you shouldn't do around Obama. Holbrooke did, which shows you something key about him. He did not know himself. He read other people well, but in relation to himself, he did not understand what he was doing. He thought he knew it, but Obama's young aides would just shake their heads and roll their eyes when he was going on in the Situation Room. And afterward, Obama would tell his top advisors, I don't want him around unless he keeps it short. I don't want to be one-on-one with him. He kept him off Air Force One when the president went to Kabul. He kind of humiliated and cut him out. And so Holbrooke's last turn was a failure. He had one very good idea, and that was, we are not going to win this war. We can only resolve it by negotiating with the enemy, which was a lesson he learned from Vietnam, and he kept thinking about Vietnam. He was like the ancient mariner at the Situation Room table telling anyone who would listen about what had happened when Barack Obama was 3 years old. And Obama would tell Hillary Clinton, tell him to shut up about Vietnam. It's not relevant. I actually think it was kind of relevant. And maybe Obama should have been a little more willing to put aside his personal feelings and listen. Holbrooke wanted to negotiate with the Taliban and began that process at the very end of his life. And in fact, in that last meeting in Clinton's office, he was briefing her on the first tentative overtures to the Taliban that had begun when his aorta dissected and he died after 20 hours of surgery. And here we are 10 years later trying to negotiate with the Taliban. So that war seems like this expense of all the built up power and capital and lives that Bosnia had seemed like the right use of, and suddenly in the post 9/11 era, it's very hard to see how the Holbrooke worldview continues to be a success.
Right. So here's a kind of a complicated question in which I want you to try to place Trump on some kind of spectrum that you could understand through the life of Holbrooke. Holbrooke was this, we're using Washington foreign policy cliches, but somewhat muscular interventionist. Obama was one of the first presidents, this is just my view, one of the first presidents who believed that part of the role of an American president is to protect the world from America's best impulses. But they're both on a spectrum. You could place Obama here, you could place Hillary Clinton here, you could place John McCain here. Holbrooke was somewhere in that Hillary range of thinking we're indispensable, we can do things, we don't have to invade every place, but we can do some things. And then Trumpism arises. Where does Trumpism fall on this spectrum, or is Trumpism a reaction to some of the assumptions that you find along the traditional foreign policy continuum?
No, I think we have not had a president since World War II who saw the world the way Trump does, and maybe never, but since World War II, we have been in a role that we weren't in before, where other countries look to us for solutions that could benefit them and which we saw as being in our interest as well as theirs. In other words, it was not a zero-sum game. We could form alliances, we could sign treaties, we could trade, we could have a web of interconnections with other countries in a structure that we designed that we would benefit from, but that would also provide security and stability and a certain amount of freedom for people around the world. And that was the idea, at least, of what the wonks call liberal internationalism, and that was Holbrooke. I'd say Obama is a little more far away from that. I think my view of Obama is he saw his role as, he saw that we were beginning to decline, and his role was to manage that decline in a way that preserved our power and that kept us from continuing to waste it as if we still had the same uncontested strength that we had in the 90s after the end of the Cold War. And Trump is the reversal of all of that. It is a zero-sum game. It's us against the rest. We might do a deal, quote unquote, if it's good for us, but why should we think of Germany or France as being any more a friend or a partner than North Korea or Saudi Arabia? Why? What do we have? What is this thing you say we have in common, these values? Those values are just a smokescreen. We're not so innocent, he once said in a famous remark to an interviewer. He does not see, the Trump worldview does not see us as either the indispensable country or the shining city on the hill. We're more like one among many, or at least a few powers that should try to remain the most powerful in order to hammer the others into submission, or at least have enough leverage over them that they'll cry uncle and do what we want.
Is Trump sort of or an organic, self-created authoritarian in the foreign policy, national security understanding? Or is something about Trump and Trumpism a reaction to the previous 70 years of American foreign policy making and the assumptions that we've made about what the role of America should be?
Well, I'm
not trying to excuse some of the absurdities, but...
I mean, Trump has apparently always kind of held these America first, isolationist, anti-trade, anti-treaty, anti-alliance views. I mean, there's interviews with him when he was in between his first and second, or his second and third marriages, and he was on the front page of the New York Post, and he was kind of talking this way. What changed was the American public began to weary of wars and policies that their leaders apparently didn't explain very well and that maybe even seemed like folly, and were willing to listen, at least some Americans, to a voice that sort of spoke to a more brutal and cynical streak that did not appeal to the better angels of our nature, but to the what's in it for me, which is, it's a remarkable turn because it's hard to think of a president who didn't at least pay lip service to democracy and to the values of democracy that we think are universal, and therefore that we should work to bring in whatever way is feasible to other countries. That goes back to 1776, and it is rare, if not unique, to have a president who is openly contemptuous of that view.
But you're saying that he couldn't do this without the acquiescence or sort of just the fatigue of the American people, or a good portion of the American people. The reason I ask this is because, you know, you think back to the 90s, I'm thinking to Bosnia and Somalia. There was actually domestic pressure for the United States to get involved in the humanitarian chaos of Somalia and in Bosnia. And it's obviously, we just have seen 500,600,000 people get killed in Syria, and no domestic pressure whatsoever on on either American president of the period to get involved. I mean,
so what happened?
Well, Iraq War
happened, Afghanistan happened, torture happened, the financial crisis happened, where elites seemed to be the only ones who got out of it intact, and they had been, in some ways, the ones who brought it on us. I mean, in a way, this is inevitable. Something like this was going to happen after 15 years of failure, disaster, elite miscalculation, irresponsibility, and a candidate. I think Trump mainly won because his opponent was Hillary Clinton, who was deeply unpopular herself, partly because she represented the political class who had, in some ways, failed for quite a while. There'd been a long string of failures, and you're going to get punished in politics if you're sitting on top of that. And Trump was shrewd enough in his kind of cockfight animal, caged animal battle way. He's not a thinker, but he has street smarts. He saw that and went for it. I remember one moment in a debate when she was talking about things that had been happening, and he said, "You've been there this whole time. Why should you be the president when you've been responsible for this?" And she hadn't seen it coming. She was talking as if she had nothing to do with these failures and setbacks, and he pinned it right on her, even if it wasn't fair, and it was a very successful.
Let me turn, and before we go to questions from the audience, let me turn this on you a little bit and note for the record that the Trump foreign policy, this is just me speaking, but the Trump foreign policy record, this quasi-isolationist, purely transactional, no discussion of democracy, that the foreign policy and the national security policies are disastrous. I mean, it's not as if he actually discovered the cure for our over enthusiastic embrace of world policemen. He's been very lucky so far in that he hasn't had to face a full-scale war with an adversary. But I mean, this is
no, it's a total. It's such a disaster that we were lucky to be able to kill, and I don't like to say that for very many people, but I think Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi deserved to be killed. The leader of ISIS.
Corbyn came out against it today.
I know, I saw that. The leader of ISIS, we were lucky. Why? Because we were in the process of betraying our only true allies in the region, the Syrian Kurds, who had given us the intelligence that allowed us to find Baghdadi, and our troops were about to be pulled out and had to speed up the operation in order to get it done before we wouldn't have enough forces to be able to back it up. In other words, Trump, I saw in the Times, I think, as an unnamed intelligence officer saying it happened more in spite of him than because of him. So that is, the record is terrible. I'm not claiming anything else. I'm just saying, I'm trying to understand, because we have to understand, how it is that a view of our place in the world that seems, at least if Richard Holbrooke would hear, would be unfathomable to him. I don't think he would have an answer for it, how that claimed enough American voters that we now have it as our foreign policy.
So this is the biggest question of all, I think, regarding America and its role in the world right now. Are we just in some part of a cycle? I mean, let's put it this way. Are we currently having a bit of a nervous breakdown about our role in the world, and in November of 2020, we'll go, oh, all right, I think we're feeling a little bit better now, and we'll return to some kind of global leadership role and avatar of democratic ideals, even if it's done somewhat hypocritically and lip service and all the rest? Or is this slide, put aside the slide toward possible authoritarianism, but is this slide toward, let's say, almost global irrelevance?
Decline,
but decline on steroids.
Yeah.
Is that, are we now just on that slope, or is this recoverable in some way?
So I'm not smart enough to predict that, but I'll give you two quick anecdotes. One is from a man named Leslie Gelb, who unfortunately died a few months ago, who was Holbrooke's best friend and is kind of the Greek chorus in my book, commenting on Holbrooke with great wisdom and love, but also deadpan accuracy. So I spent many hours in his living room talking to him and his wife. And one day I walked in and he said, Judy and I have been listening to, because he was blind at the end of his life, have been listening to a lot of books about declining empires, Persian, the Roman, this, that. I'd say we're at the midpoint of our decline. In other words, not are we in decline, but we're at the midpoint. In other words, there's still quite a bit further to go, but it's an inexorable process that is
Trump
well
was already
underway.
President?
Yeah, Trump was president at that point. And Gelb saw it in terms of kind of domestic politics and polarization, education, collapse of Americans' civic literacy, et cetera, et cetera. But he saw it as an irreversible decline. But another anecdote that's slightly less bleak, I was talking to a European diplomat in Washington, which is why I own a suit. You have to do it every now and then. And I asked him, is this permanent damage? Or is Europe never going to trust us again? Is NATO permanently weakened? Is it maybe going to end in a decade? And he said, if Trump is a one-term president, some of this could be repaired, but if he's a two-term president, it's permanent. So that puts it all on us.
Well, if you want to line up or go to a mic, we can take some questions. While you're doing that, let me ask you this short follow-up to that, which is, what is the consequence? If it's irreversible, what is the consequence for democracy?
Yeah.
I mean, in other words, Obama frequently quoted Martin Luther King, who said, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. The history is some sort of arrow flying toward a logical, reasonable future.
Yeah.
We have a lot of experience now in understanding that that's not preordained. Are we looking at, abetted by Trump, a coming authoritarian age?
I think we're in an authoritarian age. I think Trump is trying to lead the way. He's not a very good authoritarian. I mean, I think mainly what's standing in the way of Trump realizing some of his wilder fantasies of being like his idol, Vladimir Putin, is his own incompetence. But I think it's a lot more fragile than I thought. It's a lot more fragile than just being able to say what he says and have it become normal. Means it'll never be abnormal again. Once you take a taboo away, you can't really restore it. It's in some ways it feels like a plague that is hitting all of us because we're all too close to it not to be infected. It's bringing us all down in some way. One thing we should talk about maybe during the question period is, what are the alternatives? Because we can't go back to the 90s. We can't go back to Holbrooke's idealized vision of America or Reagan's idealized vision or anyone's. So are there alternatives that aren't as noxious as Trump's? I'm not hearing them on the campaign trail because they're not talking about our role in the world. There's really almost no discussion of it. And that worries me because it makes me think they're not really, the candidates aren't thinking about it and don't have a vision that can really compete with Trump's weirdly powerful appeal.
So the most positive thing I've heard you say today is that we're lucky that Trump is bad at being an authoritarian. That's the best you got.
I wouldn't underestimate that one.
Yeah, all right. Why don't we go over here?
Hi, thank you so much for the conversation, both of you. I'm Jeff Colgan. I don't normally trot out my title, but tonight it seems appropriate to say I'm the Richard Holbrooke Associate Professor of Political Science here on campus. And
that's wonderful.
I'm not a professor of Richard Holbrooke, so you know a lot more about him than I do.
He's Professor of Richard Holbrooke.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, spread out. Don't get confined to Richard Holbrooke. I can tell you, you might regret it at times.
So the question I want to ask you, though, is actually about President Obama, who says that that Vietnam is not relevant for
Could you
Vietnam
repeat?
is not relevant for Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And he not only has Holbrooke saying it is relevant, but he has the Soviets' experience in Afghanistan in the 80s to learn from as well. And Obama's not a stupid man. And so, maybe it's easy from 2019 to look back with hindsight and everything seems clear, but I guess the question is, how did we miss this idea that this would be a difficult and intractable conflict? How did the Obama administration go so wrong?
I mean,
wait,
Jeff is going to have things to say about this.
No. There's just one. I'll let you answer, but there's just this very funny, Hussein Haqqani. There's a simultaneously Pakistani dissident, but also former ambassador to the United States, who once said to me, I'll never forget this, he said, America's a fascinating country. He said, it's the only country in the world in which the expression, that's history, means that's irrelevant. So, I mean, most questions can be answered through that prism, but anyway.
Yeah. One thing about Holbrooke, he really did believe in history. Not that Obama didn't. He just didn't want to be lectured about how his administration could be destroyed by a second Vietnam from this aging man in the White House. So I think Obama got cornered. He really never believed that we could fight our way to anything like a success in Afghanistan. But he had cornered himself in the campaign in 2008 because he couldn't be for ending 2 wars. You could only want to end 1 war and get elected president. That was maybe the thinking. And he wanted to end the Iraq War, which he had always opposed. But Afghanistan he called the good war. That was the war we needed to fight because that's where al-Qaeda had attacked us from. I'm not sure whether he really believed that or not, but his rhetoric forced him to send in 60,000 60,000 troops during the first year of his presidency. And his generals made sure that he would do it by kind of boxing him in, by leaking war plans to Bob Woodward, by essentially taking advantage of the inexperience of Obama and his young aides to kind of say, we're in charge here. We know what to do. And you could really fault Obama for kind of finding the worst of both worlds. All right, we're going to send 60,000 troops, but we're going to withdraw them in 18 months, which is not a plan. It's an arbitrary deadline, which happened to coincide.
The Taliban say we'll stay in a cave for 18 months and then we'll come out. I mean, it doesn't work.
Yeah, it doesn't work, and so it's no surprise it didn't work. And I wish he had just allowed Holbrooke to sit down in the Oval Office for 15 minutes, which was Holbrooke's desperate desire, and listen to Holbrooke's ideas for how to use both talks with the Taliban and regional strategy with Pakistan, with India, with Iran. Holbrooke kind of had an idea. It may not have worked, but Obama, I think, owed it to the country and to the troops to at least listen, and instead it was a sort of bull right through it and then get out policy. Keep it off the front pages. And we're still there. So I think it's not a pretty picture for any of them.
Just one small note on that. I mean, I think if you're looking to understand why he behaved the way he did vis-a-vis Syria, which is to say, he spent the last 2 years of his presidency figuring out any possible way not to get involved deeper in Syria, and hated ISIS for all the obvious reasons, but also in a weird way resented ISIS in the sense that if ISIS had not killed 4 American hostages, there would have been no reason whatsoever for him to have gone in. And the sort of the view inside the Obama White House was ISIS was very, very stupid for doing that because we weren't really going to tamper with them. But if you want to understand Syria, you look at how he got jammed on Afghanistan and how, in a different kind of way, he got jammed by the Pentagon in Afghanistan, and he got jammed by the liberal interventionists on Libya. And then the third time around, he's like, you know what? Tribal war in the Middle East? No, thank you. And so that's where...
That's the theme of Jeff's amazing Atlantic piece, The Obama Doctrine. I was in Kabul when I read it, and I don't know if you remember, I sent you an email saying, it's brilliant, and I'm sitting like amid the evidence of it because, it's a great piece.
Go ahead.
One of the themes you bring up in the book on Holbrooke is the American century. And you talk about a strong foreign policy, robust support of the international world order. Another part of the American century was a strong national identity, a strong national government that was doing a lot of things to build a national identity and help the American people as a whole. And arguably, at this point, we've lost both of those. And I'm wondering if you see any linkage between the two and any need to address the national domestic government in connection with reviving a strong foreign policy.
I mean, I absolutely do. It's a great point because, in a way, the key to our prestige around the world was being a rich and successful democracy. It was not having the most bombers. It was not having the most nuclear weapons. It was the prestige of being a magnet for immigrants from around the world because we seem to have the formula of success and of creating a middle class that actually was growing and was able to claim a share of the pie. I mean, my last book was all about this, The Unwinding. For the last 40 years, the money has all flowed upward. The middle class has struggled. The industrial working class has been destroyed, and the heart of the country has hollowed out. And that, too, has a lot to do with the guy who's president now. So I think you're right that it's as if once we sort of broke the pact with the American people over a kind of shared identity and shared prosperity, the reason for being a world power was also broken. There was no longer both that prestige and also that sort of promise, you could say, even to the soldiers themselves who were being asked to carry this huge load, a very small number of Americans, most of them from small towns that were not doing well. And then they come home to find that no one really wants to hear about it. No one cares that much. Thank you for your service, which is sort of poison in a way to say that because it's a way of saying, can we now change the subject? No wonder there's bitterness and disillusionment. And I think the magnetism of our middle class democracy was necessary for the maintenance of our role as the guarantor of world order. And without one, you couldn't really sustain the other.
No, thank you. I read the Unwinding is a wonderful book too, and I enjoyed the connection.
Go ahead.
Hi. I tried to formulate a question a few days ago at the Susan Rice event, so I apologize in advance. I flubbed it. I want to try again because I can't stop thinking about
So
this.
George has to answer as Susan Rice?
No,
okay.
I think
Okay.
you two are also perfect to answer this question, if I can get it right. So I realize now, listening tonight, that I grew up, so I was born in 1960. I think I grew up without realizing it, believing in the Holbrooke worldview. Only recently I realized that I sort of implicitly believed in the value of the Red Line Declaration as an element of foreign policy, American foreign policy. But reflecting on Obama's Syria policy, and how many people talk about that Red Line Declaration as one of the huge points of failure. And I started to believe, I think I'm coming to believe that a Red Line Declaration is almost antithetical to our form of government and the way foreign policy is run and the way our thoughts about intervention. I mean, am I crazy? It just feels like something that we need to leave behind as a tactic.
I don't know if I can answer the question the way you're framing it. I understand the framing a bit. I would say that I spent a lot of time talking to Obama about the Red Line Declaration, and what he doesn't acknowledge much about it, but what people around him acknowledge is that you don't, when you're the president of the United States, you don't bluff, obviously. You don't sort of make an idle threat. He did that. Again, it was interesting, and this is not answering your question at all, but it's an interesting parenthetical to me at least. He did that because there were two impulses warring with each other inside him. The non-interventionist impulse, the I'm not going down that track, and the normal human moral disgust at the use of chemical weapons. And what's interesting, of course, and maybe this gets a little bit at the question, is it's not as if Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons and the world media went to the 200 or so heads of state around the world and asked them for their view. You're going to set a red line now. What's your, you went to one, the guy who mattered, right? And that's sort of an interesting. It is sort of a role that's been imposed by the world on the United States. Maybe it's not going to be imposed anymore. It's not necessarily a great role because it boxes you in. I don't know if I'm answering your question, so help me try to shape it a little bit.
It's getting at it, and I think what strikes me is that I'm starting to believe the limits of executive power to make good on it. It's like if you're the president and you're boxed in to make that declaration, you actually are pretty limited in, it's hard, it's a heavy lift to make good on it.
I mean, the smartest thing to say in that is
it really, is it too risky?
Right, the smartest thing probably to say in that case is, I'll deal with it how I see fit.
Yeah.
And just make it ominous and vague, and since we have the attention span of fleas anyway, maybe everybody would forget that kind of anodyne formulation a week later, but...
I would add that talking about the red line and about another thing Obama said, Assad has got to go, which he said very early on in the Syrian conflict, is a kind of arm's length foreign policy. We're not going to get involved. We've seen what happens in other Middle Eastern countries. So we're just going to fire some cruise missiles from a very long way off and hope that the message gets heard that we're not going to, there's a certain point after which we're not going to tolerate this. It's almost the opposite of how Holbrooke saw how to get involved in these conflicts. His view was you have to be everywhere. You have to be there really early. You have to be talking to everyone. You have to use diplomacy from the start. You don't use diplomacy after you've pounded them into submission and then negotiate the end of the war. Diplomacy is the beginning. The war is the last thing you turn to. The red line and the cruise missiles are a sign that your diplomacy hasn't worked. But we hadn't been there. We were out of it, and for maybe decent reasons. We had failed in Iraq, we had failed in Libya, et cetera. But I think one thing we shouldn't lose sight of is how utterly, I'd say multiple presidents have allowed the diplomatic muscle to atrophy. And now the limb has fallen off. And what we're seeing in Washington, you mentioned impeachment, is like the last voices of a class of people who grew up as you did, as I did, as Jeff did, believing that our government could do good and that playing by the rules was the right way to do things, and that our diplomatic service was an essential tool. This is like their revenge for having been rendered impotent, and not only by Trump, but mainly by Trump.
I'm more of an optimistic person than George, so I'm going to just frame that a slightly more...
You are right now, Jeff?
No, I am right now.
Give me the grounds.
Yeah. No. I would just say this, that there's this saving grace of this particular moment, is that the American people, we're getting to see people like Ambassador Taylor, like Colonel Vindman, people we never would have heard of because they operate anonymously. And these are not only good Americans, it seems, right? They're good people. They take their role seriously. They understand their role in democracy. They stand on principle. I mean, we're showcasing obviously some very bad. This has been a unique opportunity, this president, to showcase some really bad behavior. But the reaction to the bad behavior is actually
It's inspiring.
kind
It's
of
inspiring.
heartening.
And it's important to remember that the Ukraine mess is really about the attempt by American diplomats to get Ukraine to reform and become a less corrupt place where you could pay Richard Holbrooke $100,000 to give a speech and no one would bat an eye, a place where there was transparency and some accountability to its citizenry. And that has been the effort ever since the Maidan Revolution of 2013, 2014. So it's not a neutral policy that Trump has somehow tainted. There was a positive vision of what America can do. And in this case, okay, we weren't sending them weapons under Obama, but we were at least sending them diplomats to try to get them to clean up their thoroughly corrupt politics. Right. And that is what Trump has turned on its head and instead rendered it more corrupt. And so it's a reminder of what we can still do in the world if we don't give up on ourselves.
One more note on that, and this is my own personal view, and it's probably a little bit of a counterintuitive view, but I think now is a great time for undergraduates to think about careers in the Foreign Service. There's going to be a lot of slots open, by the way, pretty soon. And if you're interested in career development, I know nobody at Brown is interested in career development, but if you were, but I mean, it's the time. I mean, we'll if things cycle, then they'll cycle, and in 3 or 4 or 5 years, people who've made that bet might actually find themselves in happy, interesting careers.
I think that's right, because really for several decades, and this is a recurring theme throughout Holbrooke's career, going back to Vietnam, we militarized our foreign policy. We allowed the generals to make our foreign policy. Who has been the most important foreign policy figure of the last 20 years? David Petraeus, I would say. Right. So that has come to, I'd say, the logical conclusion. We have reached diminishing returns in the military's ability to impose American will. We have to turn back to diplomacy as the key tool of foreign policy.
One more thought. See, we can't even stop answering your question.
This is great.
I
feel so much better now.
I have one more thought, and then we'll go to another question.
Are you taking notes, though?
Yeah, no, I have one more thought on this, and I'm about to embarrass someone in the audience, but I watched, as a reporter 25 years ago in Liberia, Ambassador Twaddell, who is here with us today. I watched him literally stand up to multiple warlords, and look, Liberia was a chaotic situation, but without the presence of the American ambassador and the moral force and intelligence of an American ambassador in place, things could have been even a lot worse, because everybody had to listen to what the American ambassador had to say, and that was pure diplomacy. He didn't have a gun. You know, maybe you did have a gun, but I didn't see you carry. Yeah, maybe you're hiding it somewhere. But you know, and George and I both have, probably enough experience in 30, 40, 50 countries to see American diplomacy in action and to understand what the absence of that is. And that goes to this larger point. It's like, if you think the world is a pretty bad place with America as the superpower, just wait until Russia, China, and Iran are in charge of the world, and not the United States, and then you're going to see what ugly might look like. But we'll go to another.
On to the next question.
Also, by the way, I'm not assuming anything about the people who ask questions already, but students are also welcome to ask questions, and students of the non-male variety are also allowed to ask questions here. So please, so go ahead, sir, and then maybe we'll get some more questions.
Like you and a lot of Americans, I've been really perplexed and miffed by the seemingly definitely illogical and capricious nature of President Trump's decision-making process. And so I went to talk to a number of psychologist friends of mine and asked, why is he so illogical? And they said, it's easy. He's a sociopath. He fits 15 out of the 12 characteristics of sociopath. He's a malignant narcissist. Google it. I did, and they're right. So when are we going to stop talking about his policy and the decline, et cetera, and recognize that what he's doing is completely independent of the history of the United States, where we're heading, what the international situation is, and develop policies and procedures which will deal with the reality of the man's fundamental personality, as explained to me by my psychologist colleagues.
You mean invoke the 25th Amendment and try to
No, I don't mean
ease
anything.
him
I'm
out
just,
of
it's
out of
it's
the
an
way.
innocent
No, but
question.
you've moved well beyond impeachment, right to 25th Amendment.
Yeah.
Can you
I mean,
explain to everybody what that is?
The 25th Amendment allows for what the vice president
Vice
and
President
the
and the
cabinet
majority
officers
of the cabinet to remove a president if he's incapacitated. If they deem him to be
It's not
incapacitated.
gonna. It won't happen. But apparently they talked about it at the beginning of the Trump administration, and the deputy attorney general even offered to wear a wire to the Oval Office to get evidence. But the larger point, I think, is that it's not just Trump. That's my view. Yeah, we have a horrible human being in the White House. How did he get there? Why is he there? Why might he stay there for 4 more years? There's something that he's doing that is resonating with a lot of our fellow citizens whom we can't ignore, even if sometimes you want to. So I'd rather try to figure it out than simply banish him to the mental institution where crazy former presidents are sent.
I understand that, but I think the situation is so much more present at the present time that, if we put this off and we kind of like say, well, let's figure out, we don't have time to do that. We don't have time to do that. And I just, there was a really good piece in the Atlantic of all places, which
You're surprised?
No, not at all. That was an offhand compliment. Sorry about that. Religious reader of it. Okay, so which
You
talked
mean the
about
George Conway piece? Are you referring to
presidential powers.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that was the scariest thing going. I mean, you can absolutely, from a psychological point of view, if he gets cornered, predict exactly what he's going to do, and it's not a pretty picture. So
I'm not immune to the charms of your argument. We ran an 11,400 word piece by George Conway, who is a prominent Washington attorney who is also married to someone in the news, in which he basically argues makes the argument that if you don't have to be a licensed psychiatrist to understand that you're dealing with a malignant narcissistic personality. And it's a very compelling piece. I suggest that everybody look it up. But, to me, I mean, I think, I don't know about George, but to me as a reporter or as an observer in Washington, what's interesting to me is not the emperor, but all the people around the emperor who are insisting that he's wearing clothes. I mean, what we will one day think, and I'm obviously, for the third time in the Atlantic's 160-year history, we made an endorsement 3 years ago. We endorsed Hillary Clinton, so I'm not by the way, it didn't work. But I'm not betraying anything when I share my feelings about this. But we are in an unprecedented situation with the president who, whether he's clinically this or clinically that is immaterial. The behavior is the behavior. But what's interesting to me is not the president. The interesting thing is the structures of a party, very, very intelligent people within that party who are acting as if this is normal. That's the issue. This ends tomorrow if a handful of influential Republican leaders simply said, you know what, thank you for your service, but we're moving on now. I mean, so we are in, and it's very, very hard when you're in the middle of something. We can normalize to anything. That's the human gift, right? It's very, very hard when you're in the middle of something to just see how unusual it is. But, I mean, people in this room, a lot of us have been around for a while. You've seen bad presidents, good presidents, effective presidents, ineffective presidents. You haven't seen something like this. And so we don't know what to do with it. So we slot it into frames we understand. But I think what you're suggesting is we probably need an entirely new frame.
And I think the media needs to help with that desperately.
Well, I think we're getting. I think it's coming there. I think we were slow, obviously, because it was so unprecedented, and we have norms as well. And so when our norms meet a norm-breaking person, it's our tendency is just to go stick with our norms. Anyway, I'll go over here, and then we'll probably take one more, and then we'll wrap it up. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I would happily cede my time to a student if they want, but I'll ask a student-centered question. I'm putting together a course on foreign policy and the carceral state, and I wonder what you would tell students about the way that foreign policy comes home. So whether that's in surveillance or counterinsurgency tactics or drones, these other sorts of things that the Atlantic's done some wonderful reporting on mass incarceration, and so how foreign policy comes home for students concerned about the carceral state.
So is there a connection between mass incarceration and drones? I'd have to hear an argument before I would propose a course on that, because I don't want to conflate everything that one might disapprove of into one ball of ill doing. Certainly, as we became a more hardened state after 9/11, with not just surveillance, but with security everywhere, at airports everywhere, I think it has had a corrosive effect on people's sense of being an active citizenry. Instead, it encouraged people to think that the guys with guns and with sniffer dogs are taking care of it and go about your business. And it may be that it played its part, but I wouldn't exaggerate it. It may have played part of been part of the larger erosion of people's faith in democracy, which we were talking about earlier, and which I think is the core problem. And Trump is a symptom of that problem. He's not the reason for that problem. But I wouldn't go so far as to blame it on drones. I think you may disapprove of drones. You may really think that there's illegal and inhuman, but I wouldn't say, and because I don't like this and I don't like that they're somehow coming out of the same origin.
I'll go right there.
Hi. In the interest of getting one Brown student question in, I actually want to put voice to something which I do think I haven't heard that much and is maybe a more common perspective among people my age, maybe at Brown, on the sort of more progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and to sort of ask whether it might actually be a good thing, this decaying and death of the progressive interventionist elite political class. And I think what a lot of people my age who grew up with Iraq and Afghanistan sort of think is that things like Bosnia are more of an exception rather than the rule. And that as horrible as the Trump presidency is it possible that there's this sort of unintended side effect of it being this reset and this great humiliator and humbling force of the American empire? And can we move forward from here and actually emphasize a much less interventionist approach and recognize the millions of innocent lives that American foreign policy has sacrificed over just the past few decades? And how can we keep that in mind and incorporate that into future foreign policy?
I mean, it's very eloquently said. It's a totally understandable impulse, and I'm not going to tell you you're wrong, because I think your generation hasn't seen the reasons for American intervention. It has only seen the reasons not to. So it makes perfect sense. Except, as Jeff said, whenever we withdraw, the consequences seem to be bad. Not everywhere, not in every case, but generally, and in the big cases, the Middle East is now turning into a kind of great game of power struggle between Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. Is that good for the people who live there? Is that good for the rest of us? I don't see it. I think it's actually a disaster. Do we have the answers? We don't. We have withdrawn from the Middle East because we tried and failed. Maybe tried in the wrong way, maybe should have been more intelligent about it, but you don't get to keep trying. And we have failed. So, but I just think our failure and maybe our wise recognition of our own limits should not be confused with what's good for the world. Because I don't think it's gonna lead to peace and harmony. This is where, as potent as Bernie Sanders' language about justice and equality is, I think he underestimates the potential for a vacuum that we've left behind to be a very bad thing. And instead, when I hear him talking about foreign policy, he almost seems to have the idea that that states are not legitimate actors, and that in fact, what we should have is kind of an NGO foreign policy, where we find it's more like movement foreign policy, like his domestic views, where we have movements of citizens across the globe who join in the common cause of combating global warming, et cetera, which I would love to see happen, except that power is a reality that is going to be there whether we're there or not. And if we're not there, I think it's going to be something that looks more like Chinese power, Russian power, authoritarian power, and that is not, it's not going to lead to a better world in my view.
I totally understand your point, and I understand the generational divide also on this question. And your position or your conclusion, provisional conclusion, is completely logical. I would just say for you to pressure test this, I think you have to go to Afghanistan and go look at girls' schools and go meet with female gynecologists who are only allowed to become gynecologists after the Taliban was overthrown by the United States. And we have to look at, I'm just using Afghanistan since we've been talking about it. We understand that the consequence of allowing the Taliban to come into Afghanistan, back to Afghanistan, is that girls' education will then be finished again, and that female gynecologists will be killed. And so you just have to, I mean, it's complicated beyond a reasonable person's ability to grapple with sometimes. I mean, one of the great ironies, to move for another region just for a second, because you brought up China, you know, the fascinating thing about East Asia is that Vietnam, we'll use Vietnam as an example. In Vietnam, the United States polls at about 85 to 90% approval rate. This is Vietnam we're talking about. And the reason is because the Vietnamese would rather belong to an American sphere of influence than a Chinese sphere of influence. And if you look at the countries that touch, the dozen or so, almost dozen countries that touch China, with the exception of North Korea, these countries want to be aligned with the United States because they see it as a more benevolent presence in the world than they see China. So the only thing I would say to that is, to your point, is we can do terrible things. Our traditional adversaries, mainly Russia and China, tend to do even worse things. And so the world is a tragic place, and there's a kind of moral realism or tragic realism. And I think Obama probably would have called himself not an interventionist, but a tragic realist.
That's his Nobel Peace Prize speech.
That was the speech.
Yeah.
And I mean, that was the speech where he said, I believe in the use of force, and the American use of force. But it makes complete sense that you're in the place you are, but just pressure test it a little bit by figuring out what are the consequences of the United States doing the things that you want it to do. Because some better party is not going to fill that vacuum. That's the only thing I'm worried about. Can we just go over here and maybe get these last two, or the young student? Yeah. You want to just, why don't you both ask your questions together, and then we could just answer them, because I think we need to end. Or you can argue about it.
Thank you. Thank you both for this very insightful conversation. I know we only just got to it with your response to his question, but sort of talking about Asia more generally, also because I grew up outside the US and also growing up in a time when, you know, Obama and Hillary Clinton were sort of really starting this pivot to Asia foreign policy arm that really quite fell apart with this administration and never quite got carried forth, especially with those relationships to ASEAN, et cetera. And I'm wondering, I wanted to ask, do you think that, you know, in still getting in the rut and, you know, various Middle Eastern conflicts and not being able to pull out, et cetera, are we missing the chance to sort of plant the seeds of what could be, you know, our next strategic diplomatic strategy in Asia coming into this, you know, this half of the 21st century, because we have abandoned that pivot, sort of. And, you know, meanwhile, I grew up in Singapore, for example, and Singapore is really deciding who to side with on international law, for example, while China's quietly militarizing the South China Sea, whether that's the US or China, and whether the UN even plays a relevant role anymore. And, Yeah, I guess I just want to ask, as someone who's also grown up in Southeast Asia and is seeing that very missing presence diplomatically of the U.S. traditionally, where, you know, as you mentioned, even in Vietnam, it's still a high approval rate because of that more benevolent presence. Do you think we're missing the chance of what could be, or like, you know, what are the implications of the next administration if it doesn't sort of plant these seeds of what could be this diplomatic strategy?
You know a lot more about this than I do, pretty obviously, so I'm not going to pretend to give you some sage answer that you probably already have. I mean, your question kind of answers itself. We have missed a chance. Jeff's article with Obama, where he spent hours talking to the president, the theme of it is we have spent all of our time and energy and attention on a region where we really can't affect change very much. And it's come at this cost of focusing on the regions where we can. And I think even Paul Wolfowitz, who is an architect of the Iraq War, once said, you know, in the Middle East, nothing gets better, and in Asia, things are always, can get better. They can solve problems. Why aren't we there in, well, we got out of a potential trade deal that would have made us a much more important player in that region. And China smells weakness, smells our failing self-confidence and our failing will to stay involved, and is very, I think, very smart about how they are spreading their influence, both by, you know, by sweetening the pot and also by implied coercion. So I don't have any answer beyond that, yeah, it's a great missed opportunity.
Your question is an excellent question, and it's an excellent question in 2015. When we had a coherent foreign policy, and we had a coherent foreign policy discussion in this country. And now, I mean, we're in this sort of the funhouse mirror version of that conversation. And so it's not as if we have a president right now who's sitting there at night going, at what point do I have to pivot away from the Middle East and pivot toward Asia, because this is where the future American markets are in Asia and they want us there. You know, there's a total absence of strategy, and George is right, the vacuum gets filled by China. I was in Hong Kong a couple of months ago at a couple of the demonstrations. And it's actually fascinating and heartbreaking, because these are millions of people in Hong Kong who want the United States desperately to stand with them on the side of democracy and freedom. And by the way, capitalism. I mean, it's sort of the most ready-made for American consumption. I mean, people come from work at their banks and VC funds and go out and demonstrate in Chanel. I mean, it's really the most remarkable thing. And one night I was at one of these demonstrations, and they were holding up signs, we need more people by the Gucci, you know, by the Gucci store. I mean, it was really, no, I mean, it's like, democracy, freedom, capitalism, consumerism, it's all there, and they just want somebody to stand with them. And I think Obama, I tried to project back and think, George W. Bush would have been totally with it. Obama would have been, well, let's just be careful here, but, you know, obviously we stand with people who want, you know, and, you know, America really is sort of AWOL on. I mean, they are happy with the trade pressure that's going on China, but the pressure on China that's coming from Washington right now is not about democracy and freedom. It's about this transactional understanding.
I think the NBA fracas over Hong Kong is the perfect encapsulation of why we're missing and China is in charge. Let's get two more quick questions.
I know you're pressed for time, so I'll be brief. You mentioned 15 years ago, or the last 15 years of democratically led foreign policy that has failed, and how in the last election, the American public was tired of it. I was wondering if you guys saw any front runners, like in the background in Washington, who are really kind of charging the way in a new forward way of thinking.
I mean, the one candidate who seems to be thinking about foreign policy, at least in a way that I can discern contours of something emerging out of the fog, is Buttigieg, who, once I talked to him about foreign policy, I wrote a piece for The Atlantic about it, he actually is thinking about all the things we're talking about. This is going on in his head. He may not be talking about it in Iowa because it's not getting votes, and I think the chances of him ending up in the White House are rather slim. But if he did get there, I would at least feel that he had done some mental preparation for the job as commander-in-chief, or at least as the executor of our foreign policy, because I think he does see it in the terms that Jeff and I have been discussing. He has, even though he's the youngest candidate in the race, he seems to have a connection to the Holbrooke era that isn't gauzy-eyed and nostalgic.
He's the youngest old man in the race.
Yeah, but
definitely
he has a sense that we are maybe abandoning things we don't need to abandon, and that in fact, as he said to me, in the age of authoritarians, which we're in now, our role as a model, which we don't seem able to model very well, is more important than ever. There's actually a role, a place for us to be an example that, for better or worse, used to be our claim to having, some sort of leadership role. And I think that's how Buttigieg thinks about it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just have more of a comment. As the mental health worker in this audience, this is with a weird fascination with politics. Your question about why people don't stand up to him or what's going on, the warp that happens when you're around that kind of personality disorder is so intense. And I sort of think narcissism is kind of the politics of manipulation writ large. I mean, that's all it is, and it's so unconscious. And I think that I have so many people in my office who are literally trying to learn how to decode and figure out who they are in the face of such endless gaslighting and lying and moving the goalposts and all those strategies that are used. And so these people who started out in the White House thinking, oh, we better get rid of him and let's talk about emoluments, and now 3 years later are writing warnings under anonymous and somehow unable to move that. And then I watched Jim Jordan, who I can only stand to watch for about 5 seconds. And the word that comes up is flying monkey, because one thing that narcissists do is they send out flying monkeys in order to, oh, why don't you call your Aunt Betty, or what's wrong with you, and why don't you blah, blah, blah. And that's what they're doing. They've got the entire Republican Party is essentially sort of flying monkeys from my perspective. And so I'm just like, I would love to see an article that marries that level of understanding with your level of the policy and the politics.
I mean, I think you're right about people who went in good faith, thinking they were serving the country by joining the Trump administration. I don't agree with you about the Republican Party. I think it's far more of a dark and cynical picture. I think it's the party's leaders have made from the start a really brutal calculation that their own hides and the power of their party depended on their pretending that this was a normal president who, whose behavior, and views weren't utterly reprehensible. My analogy is more like, I don't know if you know the novel Darkness at Noon by Kessler. It's about an old Bolshevik who finds himself in prison and confesses to crimes he didn't commit and gets executed. Why does he confess? He's not really tortured. He confesses because he has so sold himself to the party that he can find no reason not to do what the party wants. And at this point, the party wants him to confess to a crime he didn't commit in order to be part of a show trial that will terrorize the public and be executed. I think the Republicans are like that old Bolshevik. They don't have, I'm talking about the party leadership, not the voters, the rank and file, but Mitch McConnell and 100 people like him and their allies in the media have, I think it's with open eyes, very clear and open eyes, have made the decision that it's better for them if they go along with it. And for that, I think history will never forgive them.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone. Thank you.